In the last episode, we talked about what we might call cultural Christians. People who wanted to affiliate with Christianity in the Roman Empire, but at the same time were either unwilling or unsure of how to fully adopt the practices and beliefs that were common in the early church. It may have also been the case that these were true Christian converts, but because of a growing climate of hostility and persecution towards Christians, especially in the 2nd century AD, decided it would be expedient to embrace a version of Christianity that appeared more tolerable in the context of Roman religion. In today's episode, I'd like to look at common accusations against Christians. Very little survives from this period from non-Christians because Christians ended up winning this culture war. And as a result, many of the polemics against Christianity were not preserved. But it is possible to look at early Christian sources and get a sense of the main arguments against this growing movement. We'll talk about all of this on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 63, Christianity in the Pax Romana, Part 3. Before we begin, I'd just like to say thanks again for listening to the podcast, and I would encourage you, especially if you enjoy this episode and the others that I've put together, to rate the podcast, let your friends know, share links to the podcast on social media. I very much enjoy putting this podcast together, and it means the world to me to have your support. Thank you so much. The modern English word for religion comes out of the Latin term religio, a word that does not so much describe belief in the gods, but obligation to them. That is, religio is the correct performance of rituals and rites. Throughout the Roman Empire, regardless of what particular religious tradition one adhered to, there was a general lack of importance of right belief, or what we might call orthodoxy. In fact, many of the myths and stories about gods had all sorts of variations and contradictions, and this was perfectly fine. There was no need to find exact truths about who the gods were and what exactly they did. In fact, a well-adjusted person in the Roman Empire, especially an elite, would engage in many religious practices. One wants to cover one's bases, to obtain health and wealth and advantage, to obtain good luck. Now, I don't want to say that belief didn't matter, just that it was a distant second to the most important aspect of religio, which is what we might call piety or loyalty. And the Roman concept of loyalty really derives from two statements that all practitioners of Roman religion thought to be true. Statement number one, the gods engage in terrestrial affairs. Okay, the gods intervene on earth in the lives of normal people. They do this. They are not distant. They did not wind up the clock and then leave it. No. The gods do things in this life. Statement number two, human behavior can and does influence the behavior of the gods. The logic here is actually simple. If the gods are involved in human affairs and human can influence this involvement, that is, they can earn divine rewards or punishments, then the object of right religion is to figure out the best way to obtain rewards from the gods and to avoid punishment from the gods. Put more crassly, it is a person's duty to contract with the gods, to improve that contract with negotiations. And that is what a person is doing when they are performing sacrifices, other rituals, when they are taking omens and auspices. You want to ensure that things will go well. You want to check that the gods are happy with you. In short, you do not want to be haphazard about religion. The sacrifices and rituals are to be elaborate and detailed, which of course makes sense. Greater displays of piety are likely to lead to greater rewards. And the Romans have all sorts of rituals, everything from cooking meals to the gods, burning incense, giving them cakes or flowers, or even small gifts like candy. You can give gods money. You can also make vows to the gods. This is very, very common. If the god does X, then the worshiper will do Y. And you might leave an object at a temple as proof that you have taken such a vow. Prayers, of course, are a normal part of Roman religion, and some temples even kept records of prayers that had been answered. In all of this, the point is the belief in the specific forces behind these rituals was nowhere near as important as correctly practicing the rituals themselves. True belief was not as important as true practice. And this is what Christians had backwards. Christians believed that true belief would then lead to true practice. One of the nice things about Roman ideas about religion is that it's pretty tolerant. That is, Romans practice what they call interpretatio. This is the notion of equivalence between deities and religious practices across cultures. A Roman has no problem with the idea that their supreme deity, Jupiter, could also be Zeus in Greece, or Baal in the East, or Mithras in Persia, or in the camps of soldiers, increasingly at the end of the Pax Romana. The Romans even respect religious practices that don't fit as neatly into their own practices, so long as that religion can prove that it is sufficiently ancient and that its peoples have been able to derive benefits from their worship. The Jewish people, for example, would fall into this category. It's important that you know all of this because it helps frame the concerns that Romans had with Christians. And what I want to do is try to get into the Roman mindset to understand from their perspective why Christianity was so dangerous. So let's get into it. I think we can boil down the common accusations against Christians into 5 categories. Some of these will make sense, but others may sound strange, even oxymoronic in a way. Let me go ahead and explain. The first thing that we see is that Romans were hostile to Christians for the name. This is a phrase that we see in Pliny's letter to Trajan. And I talked about that letter on episode 33. I encourage you to go back and look at it. But in summary, Pliny the Younger was governor of a Roman province, and he had to figure out what to do with some Christians that were brought to his attention. It's very clear in the letter that Pliny wrote to the Emperor Trajan that Pliny himself did not really understand why Christians were a problem. And he asks Trajan explicitly, is it just because they call themselves Christians? In other words, is this simply an identity category that is unfavored in the Roman Empire? And I think the answer to that question is yes. Simply calling oneself a Christian, regardless of what a person believed or the rituals that they practiced, could be in and of itself a problem in certain parts of the Roman Empire. The second of these 5 common accusations is one of those that seems oxymoronic. It seems like a contradiction in terms, and that is Christians were accused of atheism. This charge is rooted in the fact that Christians refused to worship Roman gods with traditional methods. They did not sacrifice animals. They did not burn incense. They did not negotiate with their deity. They did not participate in the public rituals and festivals and take the various oaths that Roman citizens took, many of which were in the names of non-Christian gods. And so as a result, the Christians were viewed as godless people. Now, if the charge of atheism still seems incomprehensible to you, let me try to explain it this way. In the modern world, we live in a society, especially in many Western countries, which are or have been closely connected to Christianity. We are more likely to see religion as at least partly based on a set of beliefs, on theology, on ideas about who God is and who God is not. But the most important thing for most inhabitants of the Roman Empire was religious practice. One needed to participate in the various rituals. The meaning of these rituals, their significance, their effects, all of these could be disputed and negotiated. Contradictions were perfectly fine. Mythological stories that explained them could be different, could be incoherent, could have questionable morality. None of that mattered. What mattered is that the gods acted in reality based on the proper administration and practice of the rituals and sacrifices. And so even if people disagreed about what they meant and what they were, everybody needed to do them nevertheless. But the Christians don't do that because they have a religion based on belief. And so to the Romans, that is atheism. It's not about whether one believes in the gods or not. Rather, atheism is defined as not practicing the accepted traditional religious rituals. And this is viewed as very dangerous because these rituals work. The religious rituals make the sun rise in the morning. They make the fields produce grain. They make the winds blow. They make the rains fall. The rituals bring new births. They bring success in war. Anybody who doesn't participate in them is not only an atheist themselves, but they are endangering their community. So this charge of atheism is deeply troubling for the Romans. Adjacent to the charge of atheism is the third concern with Christians, and that is sedition. Christians did not worship Roman gods in Roman ways, and they also did not honor the Roman emperor and his officials in ways which the Romans demanded. Now, we have plenty of evidence from as early as the New Testament writings that Christians were willing to obey many orders of Roman officials, but they were uncompromising when it came to any orders that broke the tenets of the Christian faith. Some of the forms by which emperors were honored involved taking oaths to gods, worshiping or sacrificing to an image of the emperor, burning incense to that image, and Christians were completely opposed to these practices. They were idolatry as far as the Christian was concerned. But again, for the Romans, this was deeply dangerous. Only a truly vile person and a seditious person would not appropriately honor the emperors and Roman officials. The fourth category of accusations against Christians comes largely out of the fact that Christians did not meet in public. And so the assumption was that in private, Christians must have been doing immoral things. The Romans have had a suspicion of secret societies for a long time. Back in the days of the Roman Republic, late 3rd, early 2nd century BC, hundreds of years before Christians were prominent, hundreds of years before Christ was even born, the Romans sought to suppress what is called the Bacchanalia. These were private gatherings of worshipers of the god Bacchus. His Greek counterpart is Dionysus, a god of revelry and wine and harvests and merrymaking and a variety of other things. And it may not surprise you that the way this god was worshipped was through what are called orgia, which is where we get the modern word orgy. These were drunken, debaucherous parties, and Romans have this intrinsic idea that many private religious gatherings may include such rituals. And some of the language that Christians used to describe what they did during their meetings raised further suspicion. For example, it was widely known that Christians ate the body and drank the blood of their own God, Jesus Christ. Now, most people probably know that I'm referring to what would be called the Eucharist or the Communion or the Lord's Supper, right? It is a meal of wine and bread. It is not actually engaging in literal cannibalism. But for the Romans, this was an accusation. It was supported by the fact that Christians typically rescued foundling children, children that had been left out by Romans for exposure because there was some defect in the child, or the child maybe was a daughter and father wanted a son. Christians were notorious for collecting these children and raising them up. But critics of the Christians believed that what the Christians were really doing was grabbing these babies so that they could eat them. It was also suspicious to Romans that Christians called each other brother and sister, which alone is not grounds for concern. But if we add to it the suspicion that Christians in their meetings were engaged in sexual activities, then suddenly accusers can say, well, look, there's incest going on in these meetings. There's private meetings, and we know that private meetings tend to be sexual in nature, and these are people that claim to be brothers and sisters with each other. Now, of course, these charges are all inaccurate, but that doesn't really matter. The point is, it was possible to build a case against Christians on the grounds of immorality. And the charge of immorality was substantial enough to force Christian apologists to defend their faith against these same charges. That leaves us with the fifth category of accusation, and this is what the Romans would call superstitio, or what we might consider religious novelty. The Romans want inhabitants of their empire to practice religions that have proven the test of time, and it is in fact good for even provincials who do not believe in the Roman gods to practice their ancestral religions, provided that those religions do not have egregious concerns, things like human sacrifice, for example. So Judaism, despite being a monotheistic religion that is very different than traditional Roman religions, is in and of itself not a problem for Romans. It's an old religion. The Jews could legitimately claim that their God has protected them for thousands of years, and the Romans could see that and respect it. But Christians do not have such a legacy. Now, of course, Christians claim the inheritance of Israel. But for the Romans, who are looking so closely at practices, the Christians are not circumcising themselves. They're not participating in animal sacrifice. They don't have the priests and rabbis that Jewish people do. So for the Romans, at best, Christians are Jews that have totally forsaken their ancestral traditional practices. And even worse, Christians are going to Jewish people and non-Jewish people and asking them to abandon their ancestral religious practices. So not only are the Christians involved in superstition and novelty when it comes to religion, they are spreading such dangerous ideas. So just from a Roman perspective, if we adopt their way of thinking about religion, it is quite understandable as to why many Romans and inhabitants of the Roman world found Christians so troubling. So why didn't these claims, which are pretty damning, stop Christianity in its tracks? From a purely anthropological or sociological perspective, there's no reason it should have survived. These are devastating accusations. But as we'll see in the next episode, there were plenty of literate Christians who were capable of writing thorough defenses. These were men trained in Roman law and philosophy, and they approached Christianity as Romans. They understood the accusations, and they addressed them in ways that were persuasive. And so even as persecution began to ramp up at the end of the Pax Romana, Christianity itself was able to survive, even if many Christians did not.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.